before I introduce him. Thank you guys so much for coming. Really appreciate everyone being here, taking your Friday to come listen to our really the first guest lecture the Biodynamics and Human Performance Center has hosted. Since a year ago, I was awarded this Waters Faculty Fellowship. It's something that I've been really interested in doing, is bringing in people from the community and from the country that I envy as scientists. And so I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Lee Stoner today. Lee is an associate professor just recently at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he is also the director of the Cardiometabolic Laboratory. He did his bachelor's in sports science at Brunel University in London, in the UK. His master's and his PhD locally in Athens at the University of Georgia, where he studied under Kevin McCulley, who many of you are familiar with or know. And then he did an MPH at Massey University in New Zealand. And I got to ask, was that online or was it in person?
No, I was living there.
You were living there. Okay,
yeah,
so he did
my
MPH
postdoc in New Zealand as well.
and a postdoc in New Zealand. Lee's research interests, and this is why I love Lee, because it says on his CV, just who Lee is really tuning your ticker. Lee describes it as. And so therein, he has three kind of research areas that he focuses on. First is the interactions between lifestyle and cardiometabolic disease. He's also interested in non-invasive assessments of cardiometabolic health, and specifically arterial stiffness and endothelial function. And then the translation of basic and applied science outcomes into public health practices, which we're going to hear a little bit more about today. Lee's CV, last time he sent it to me, had 263 publications on it, with an H-index of 42 and close to, and maybe probably over now, 6,000 citations. He's brought in, at minimum, $37 million of funding, and he currently has two active R01s, which is kind of one of the highest grants you can get from the National Institute of Health as a PI. He has an absolutely huge laboratory of postdocs, doc students, master's students, and undergrad. And I think the thing that's really great about Lee that you're not going to find on his CV is his sincere desire to help and elevate others, and myself in programs like this. So I met Lee a couple of years ago at the Southeast American College of Sports Medicine conference when I had just gotten the StigmaCore device to assess arterial stiffness. And I'm looking at, the publications there and the presentations, and it's like, wow, this Lee Stoner guy has like 40 different abstracts. This is absolutely insane. Hopefully he doesn't show up to my student's presentation because we barely know what we're doing. And sure enough, there was Lee in the back of the room. And despite running such a massive laboratory and being so busy, he's never hesitated to provide honest and insightful feedback whenever I reach out via email. He's always there to help out, and he's been super helpful in our lab and my understanding and moving into the cardiovascular space. So I really appreciate that. I think it's pretty remarkable to find the scientist at his level who's so open and honest and willing to help and come to Georgia Southern to talk to us today. And so without further delay, I'd like to introduce Lee and his presentation, The Hitchhiker's Guide to Developing Sedentary Behavior Reduction Policies. Thank you, Lee.
After his introduction, it's going to go downhill from here. So I might as well just go. But thanks so much for coming out and listening today for a topic that I'm really passionate about. You just heard most of this. I like to tell people who I am. I'm from England originally. You can tell because I'm suave and debonair. Just like I am a citizen of New Zealand as well, and in New Zealand people call themselves Kiwis, so I call myself a Britwee. But I will get my American citizenship early next year, so I'm going to be a Mary Britwee or a Mary Britwee or looking for names right now. What you said you had one?
I said Burger Britwee.
Burger Britwee, maybe Burger Britwee. My interest in physiology started in boxing. I boxed for 15 years, amateur and pro. And then you heard a bit about my education. This is the better side of me, my wife and stepdaughter Emma. And here's the rest of the family. I've also Harry, I've got him on my feet today. Well, you want to see him more closely. Harry's the big one. But like the mission of our lab, and Greg alluded to this, my biggest passion is mentorship. And within my lab, it's important that everyone who comes through develops 3 skills: leadership, communication, and self-promotion. And then, of course, science is important to us too, because one doesn't go without the other. Here's my lab currently. I won't go into all of those. We do have a lot of undergrads working with us and high school students as well. That list is actually expanded, but I didn't have time to update it. And as you heard, my general theme is tuning in your ticker, but more specifically, I'm interested in lifestyle behaviors and cardiometabolic health, and our particular focus and the area that's paying the bills is sedentary behavior.
Hello, my name is Lee.
That's from a previous slide, obviously.
I
But I think there's another just something.
I thought it was me at first. I'm glad it was you.
Now, I mean, you all heard of this term, sedentary behavior. It's been over the news a lot. It's been claimed to be the new smoking, but it is confused a lot, and I don't think people have a true understanding of it or exactly why it is important. So I want to start today just by telling you why it is important, and to help that, I'm going to give some historical perspective before we dig a bit deeper into where do we currently stand in terms of policy. And by policy, I'm talking about a specific type of policy. I'm interested in developing guidelines on where we're at. Where is the evidence, and how do we develop that evidence? So let's start here. And again, people do confuse these terms. I just want to make sure we all start off on the same page. I'm sure most of you know the first couple, physical activity. So that's just any movement behavior that requires expenditure. Exercise comes under physical activity, right? It's a very specific part of physical activity because it's planned. And then we have physical inactivity, which again, people conflate with sedentary behavior, and they're not. They're two very different things. Physical inactivity is a lack thereof. So it means that you're not meeting guidelines. If you're not getting that 150 minutes a week, you are physically inactive. Sedentary behavior is an actual behavior. It's not the lack of something. So right now I'm moving around, so I'm doing the right activity. You're all sitting on your asses, so you're all being sedentary right now. But more specifically, we define it as very low intensity behaviors, those that are below 1.5 METs, in a seated, reclined, or supine posture while conscious, so sleep doesn't count as sedentary. Here's another way of looking at it, a figure that we put together just to show this, starting from sleep and his sedentary behavior through to light activities. I don't know, I consider standing light activity, that's a whole nother discussion though, through to the moderate to vigorous physical activity. And then if we consider these activities in the context of a typical day, about a third of it is sleeping, right? So those of you in here that are students, that's probably less than a third, right? But we're supposed to be getting at least anyway 8 to 9 hours. And then if, and this is a big if, right? If you are achieving physical activity guidelines, you're engaging in physical activity for 30 minutes a day, every day, right? And that's a big if. Most people are not doing that. Even if they say they're doing that, they're not doing that. Like, based on objective estimates, about 10% of the population is actually meeting that guideline. And then a big part of the day is light activities. And then a huge part of the day is also sedentary behavior. Now, I'm being kind here. It's actually more than 7.5. It's probably over 9 hours. So I was just trying to compartmentalize it into 3 neat categories. Now, what do we know about this behavior, though? I've told you it is distinct from physical activity, but who cares? It can't be that important, right? You're just sitting there. Can't be that bad for your health. Well, we now know, based on epidemiological evidence at least, and that which has been consolidated in the form of position statements from both national public health bodies as well as the World Health Organization, that the level of evidence for an overall and dose response association between sedentary behavior and cardiovascular disease mortality is strong. So this behavior that you're doing right now is damaging your heart, right? And it's not that simple. I'm not saying you should all get up. Well, I shouldn't be saying that because then you'll leave and won't hear me talk, right? But and we will get into a bit more of the nuances on that. But if you engage in a lot of this behavior, it's bad for you. Here's some of the evidence that supported this statement. This is data from over 1 million subjects, and this is a study done by Eklund. And in this, he broke down physical activity into quartiles. So less than 2.5 Met hours a week, that's next to nothing. 16 Met hours a week, that's about where our guidelines are, right? About 30 minutes a day, 30 Met hours a week, and then 35. This is about 70 minutes a day, every day. And then he breaks down within each of these quartiles how sedentary you are, from more than 8 hours to less than 4. And on this figure then, on the y-axis, we have hazard ratio. So 1 means that there's no risk compared to the control group. And here, this is the control group, the highly active one. Now, they probably shouldn't be the control group, right? That's not normal, but that's a different consideration. And you see the dashed line across there. So that's representing no risk, right? No increased risk of being less physically active, and then within these more sedentary. If we look at where the guidelines are, all of these categories of sedentary behavior are above this one, right? What this means is if you're achieving physical activity guidelines, it don't matter in terms of your risk associated with sedentary behavior. Right? Sedentary behavior is still having negative consequences. And there are lots of people like this that are highly physically active, but also highly sedentary, right? And that physical activity is not protecting against being sedentary. Now, there doesn't seem to be a real protective effect until we get down to here, the really high levels of physical activity. Now, who in this room does 70 minutes a day, every day? So 1, right, you're all right, the rest of you are screwed. But, so you need to be getting up every now and again. So the take-home message so far, right? We know that there's strong association between sedentary behavior and cardiovascular disease risk exists. And that was just some evidence, there's a lot more than that. We know that physical activity, unless you're very highly active, does not protect against that sedentary behavior. And based on this, we still don't understand fully, but we believe sedentary behavior is a biologically novel risk factor for disease. Okay, let's just take a step back in time for a moment then so we can better understand this behavior. So if we look at our Paleolithic ancestors, right, so about 50 to 10,000 years ago, right, these are our closest genetic cousins, they were highly dependent on hunting and gathering. Now, this is a grand generalization. Not every population was so dependent on hunting. I'm just stereotyping. And because of this, they were genetically programmed to be physically active, but they was also programmed to conserve energy, so to be sedentary. And this was needed, right? If they was hunting, and then there was a period where they didn't have much food, they needed to conserve whatever they had. So it didn't make sense from them, from a survival stance, to be doing things all day. Yet, in these, and we can look today in hunter-gatherer populations, we don't see evidence of atherosclerosis, right? One of the processes leading to cardiovascular disease. Now, lifespan was shorter due to things that happen outside of atherosclerosis in their environment and so on, right? So that's obviously one answer. But atherosclerosis, we can detect fatty lesions in kids as young as 7. It's estimated 10 to 20% of you guys in here have advanced atherosclerotic lesions and you don't know about it, right? It's insidious. There's no symptomology. But okay, right. So they were sedentary, but did it really look the same? Were they really doing the same thing? Cool jumper, like it. Sweater in American vernacular. Sweater. You got the cold sweater. There's no way to know for sure, right, what they actually did. So our best guess is looking at indigenous populations that exist today. One of which is the Hazda population in Africa. Now, if we look at this population, and we're going to come back to one of my friends here, Herman Ponsa and David Ratlin. They observed that this population sat for about 9.5 hours each day, and that the average bout length was 15 minutes. Now, if we look at us, it's estimated we sit for about 9.5 hours a day, slightly longer bout lengths, but not drastic differences between the two. So our sedentary behavior patterns are not that different from our ancestors. So there's a picture of Herman up there, and I'm pointing them up here because we're going to come back to him later. If we take a closer look, though, they're not sitting the way that we do. They didn't have chairs for a start, right? That's a modern invention. And here, and on this graph, they recorded the positions that they're in and the percent that their musculature is engaged relative to full activation. And most of the time it's in ground sitting and some of it squatting. So they're engaging that musculature while they are being sedentary. They're not doing it in the same way that we are. So they're kind of active sedentary. I don't know the best way, the best vernacular to use for that, but it's not the same. And then this is just some of the EMG evidence showing the same thing, but looking at the different muscle groups from the tibialis through to the vastus lateralis, just supporting the same thing. You know, at the face of it, at a macro level, our sedentary behavior levels are the same as our ancestors, but the way that we were sedentary was very different. There's no reason for this. It's just a cool bird. This is a cassowary bird that you find in northeast Australia and in Papua New Guinea. This is the world's largest or heaviest land bird. Unfortunately, they are at risk of going extinct, but they're very cool birds. Not one that you want to meet, that you want to run, because they got very big talons. Right? Anyway, back to sedentary behavior. Let's look at where we stand with our current policy. Now, for this journey, we need to begin with, where did exercise start? Right? Who knows in the area this guy is? Okay, this is the kind of father of exercise. This is Jim Morris. Jim Morris conducted what is now known colloquially as the bus conductor study. He was the first person to look, we didn't call it exercise then, but the first person to look at it, and probably more physical activity than exercise, but here's our roots, and he observed bus conductors and drivers, so those would sit in all day, and found that the ones that were driving, i.e. sitting more and less active, had a greater risk of coronary heart disease. If we forward along to more recently, we have more objective data, and back then, it was just men. Women didn't matter, right? Now, fortunately, yeah, women are people too. You get rights. And on this is using NHANES, our national health. We've got it broken down by men and women, and the patterns are similar. On this y-axis, this is deaths per 10,000. This is the amount of light physical activity, and this is the amount of moderate. So as the low physical activity goes up, it doesn't have much of a protective effect. It's the moderate to vigorous physical activity, right? Even if you've got low amounts of light, you're still protected. So we know physical activity is very important for both all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease. And consider as well, we now have enough evidence, because this research we've been doing since 1953, when that first study was published. So we've got enough evidence to inform things like this, right? We can prescribe the amount of activity one should be obtaining in terms of frequency, intensity, time, and type, or fit. We've got very simple guidelines we can give people. Now, we do have pretty good understanding, right? We've had almost 70 years of research in this area. However, if we look here, here's what we can explain in terms of exercise is health benefits in terms of the cardiovascular system. About 65% of the benefits of exercise remain unknown. Now, we still have enough evidence to prescribe exercise dosage, even though there's a lot that we don't know. Now, coming back to sedentary behavior, right, which is a behavior that we all have in common and we engage in a lot of, we know even less than that. We know next to nothing. Right? We know it's biologically distinct, but we have a very, very limited understanding. But sedentary behavior is a nascent field. You know, we've only just begun researching this area. And because we don't have the evidence, we can't form solid policy yet. Policy is dependent on the strength of the evidence. If we look around the world, the Canadians are actually in the lead in this area. They break down their policy in terms of the 24-hour activity cycle and tell you about physical activity, sedentary time, and sleep. If you look at the sedentary time guidelines are fake, that's the best that we know right now, and even some of this, none of that's based on real hard evidence. The Australians have done something similar. Here's an example from Belgium, where they're showing what we should be doing throughout the day, pictorially. And then here's what we have in the US: move more and sit less. Right, but again, right, these are our latest physical activity guidelines. This is where we stand in terms of the evidence. So this is very fair, because this is all we can say right now. So our current policy then stands at 150 minutes for physical activity, 7 to 9 hours for sleep, sedentary behavior, move more, sit less. Right, we got some work to do. Why? Why is this policy limited? Well, for a start, as I said, we know it's biologically distinct, but we don't know how and why. We have very limited mechanistic understanding, and because we don't have mechanism, we can't identify optimal strategies for reducing sedentary behavior, and therefore providing guidelines for reduction. Now, I tell people I study this stuff, and people say to me, "Oh, well, why don't you just tell people to sit less?" Right? So I respond, "All right, why don't you exercise more, eat better, sleep better, stop smoking, etc., etc." Right? Does that work? Does that work for any of you in here ever? Right? When you expect, if your parents have told you to do something, have you ever really listened to them? No. Right? That just telling people does not work. Right? We need clear guidelines that are palatable for the masses. And consider though, right? I mean, here we've got exercise, nutrition, sleep, smoking, big things. And arguably way more complicated than sedentary behavior, right? Way more difficult to change. We're not doing very well in we've done well with smoking, a large part of the taxation policy, right? The rest of them, we're doing terribly, and we're doing worse every year. And sedentary behaviour is easier to change. But right now, we just don't know what to tell people to do. So the take home so far, then, you know, our policy for physical activity is guided by evidence that began to accumulate in 1953. Sedentary behaviour is just a right? But we do have some policy, but it's company very non-specific. And we know that just telling people to stop does not work. Oh, here's another picture of a bird. This time, this is a giant moa. This is the largest bird that ever lived, and this is just to let everybody know that New Zealand is better than Australia, because these birds lived in New Zealand and they were huge. Now there's also, I don't know if stupid is the right word, but you know, when they got there, they had no natural predators. So the Maori got there 900 years ago, and they would just stand there where Maori run at them with a spear and probably hunted them to extinction. But they didn't have very good survival strategies, but you know, that wasn't part of their evolutionary process. But the key message is New Zealand's better than Australia, right? Okay, so next then, let's look at what guides policy. I like to use this. This is the framework by the United States Preventive Services Task Force. And the mission of this task force is to review evidence and then based on that evidence provide recommendations for preventative services being integrated within primary care. And to do this, they look at 3 lines of evidence. They look at the individual studies, they look at the linkage between the studies and the questions being posed by the studies, and then looking at all of that, the existence and magnitude of the causal connection between the preventative service or the intervention and the health outcome, right? So that, you know, the preventative services may be, say, exercise prescription, right? And the outcome might be diabetes. And then if this evidence exists, then the task force considers the magnitude of the net benefit, whether it can be extrapolated, and how generalizable it is across populations, and they'll give it a grade, A, B, or C. For exercise right now, we have a B grade. And it looks something like this if you look at it pictorially, right? Someone walks in to primary care, first, whatever it is, it's got to be able to be screened, right? So if this is physical activity, they've got to be able to screen for it. And then they've got to be able to also detect the target condition, and then the treatments. So this again might be exercise. There results hopefully in a reduced morbidity and mortality, but you've got to be able to measure that. So there's got to be an intermediate outcome. An intermediate outcome means not final outcome, right? This is something that you can measure that is highly associated with the final outcome, like Greg mentioned, arterial stiffness earlier on, right? We know we can keep that down, they've got less cardiovascular disease risk. Now, some questions though, what kind of evidence do we need for each of these boxes? I said it all needs to be linked. How do we do that? And then there has to be causality here, right? Meaning that it makes sense if you give this intervention, the outcome you're seeing is due to the intervention, not to some other variable. We call this biological plausibility. Now, this is a simple view, but this is what is called the pyramid of clinical evidence. So when the policymakers are looking at the evidence, the strength of the evidence is adjudicated traditionally by the study design, right? And up the top here, we have randomized control trials. So these are big, expensive, highly controlled trials that tell us how efficacious an intervention is. If there's enough of these, then you can do a meta-analysis and systematic review. So when these start to accumulate, policymakers will take note. Now, because we see this RCT up here, we put a lot of weight into that, and many people try to start the problem by starting here instead of like working their way up to the problem. And this results in Islegate, meaning it seemed like a good idea at the time, right? Which is what we do in exercise sciences all the time. See, oh, that worked for someone with stroke, we're going to do it with someone with diabetes, without actually thinking about what we're trying to solve or whether it suits that population. So I think there needs to be what I'm calling PBS, or problem-based research, right? Why? Because right now, most of the research we do has no impact, none, right? Most of it. As an academy, we're not doing very good. We're lucky if 10% of it, and I think it's way lower than that, actually has any impact on society whatsoever. There's a lot of research redundancy, a lot of people doing science for science sake, which is great if you're not hurting someone, but if you're taking taxpayer money in the form of grants, you should be solving a problem. So how do we solve this? Well, we need to start with the problem, right? And then work back from there rather than starting with the RCT. So the take-home message is policy development is a bloody long process. There aren't any shortcuts. You can't just start at the RCT and expect to make big change. It just does not work that way. So I'm going to tell you about Red said, I think I'll put this in the wrong way. So Red said is what we're developing is a framework to guide reduction in sedentary behavior. And there are lots of theories and lots of models out there, and it's very confusing. And I should tell everyone, I'm a physiologist. I am not a behavioral scientist. I am not an implementation scientist. I'm not even an interventionist, right? But I do want to make a difference with this problem. So I have to understand these things so that I can solve the problem, which brings us to this framework we started to develop. And here's where I'm at right now. So we start with the problem, and then we have the pre-intervention phase, right? And I'm going to unpack all these shortly. So don't worry about looking at all of this right now. I'm going to tell you what they are. I'm just showing you what our actual model is. We have the pre-intervention phase, then we get to the intervention, and then we have the policy development phase before we get to the solution. And notice the arrows are bi-directional. It's not a nice, neat, linear process. Sometimes you have to take a step back. So the problem then, well, why don't we start with the observed health issue, right? Rather than trying an RCT or doing science and expecting someone else is going to make use of it, right? It just does not work that way. So in this instance, say I know there's this strong evidence for an association between sedentary behavior and cardiovascular disease risk. That's about the extent of it right now. That's all I know. But I know that or I believe that if I can reduce sedentary behavior, that I can decrease cardiovascular disease risk of the population. So that's the problem. Now, again, we want to start there, right? And a lot of people are starting there at the solution. The solution comes all the way at the other end. So just keep your eye on the prize, right, as you do these things. Then we have the pre-intervention phase, and I can see a big part of this as establishing biological plausibility and seeing if that behavior is mechanistically associated with the health outcome that we are trying to fix. And here, things that we need to consider are biological plausibility, that term I mentioned earlier on. You know, we have to start to establish that causal relationship. We'll come back to this because we don't stop here. We're just trying to establish it before we move forward, right? Then we can move on to mapping the intervention. And then after we design an intervention, we don't then just go to the intervention. There are other stages in between, including a feasibility study. So let's have a quick look at that. Here's some major considerations for biological plausibility. First, you know, if we're looking at the association between a behavior and a health outcome, we have to be able to measure it. If we can't measure it, we can't establish that relationship, or we can't see if it changes. And you saw that this intermediate outcome. That was part of the policy model as well. So we have to make sure we're picking the right outcomes. As an example, often there's been many public health interventions that have looked to fix obesity in kids with exercise, and then they use BMI, right? You couldn't have a worse outcome because the BMI may actually increase, because especially if they're obese kids, you probably want to engage them with strength type exercises to start with to build up their fitness and the confidence and so on. And then you say, oh, that $3 million, we didn't learn that much, we should just move on to the next thing. Oh well, that's not the right way to do things, right? So we need to make sure we've got an intermediate outcome that works. And then we have to start thinking about validity. At this stage, we're particularly concerned with internal validity, which is the cause and effect relationship, but it doesn't mean we take our eye off of external and ecological validity. And here's the biological model that we're working with. I'm not going to go through all of this, but with sedentary behavior. But basically, we think that if you sit down for too long, all the blood pools in the lower extremities, and this results in a cascade of events that have hemodynamic, autonomic, and metabolic consequences that come together to put burden on the heart. Right, and you see we've got before that arterial stiffness. That is our intermediate outcome. And again, if we zoom in a bit on there, I'm just showing one part of the pathway here. Blood pools. If blood pools, let's go back to the heart. Let's go back to the heart. Less venous return. Less Frank-Starling mechanism, meaning we're able to push less blood out of the heart. If less blood is going out of the heart, aortic blood flow decreases, which means decreased shear stress, which is stress that blood cells place on the wall, is placed on the aortic wall. Shear stress is good for the vessels if it's the right type of stress. If that goes down, and then that vessel starts to become dysfunctional, and then that increases arterial stiffness. So again, there's our intermediate outcome. This needs a lot of thought when you're designing studies. Your outcome is crucial. So again, we just think that the main thing that we're interested in here, arterial stiffness and that blood pooling. And again, at this stage, we're particularly concerned with internal fluidity. We want to control everything as much as possible, because we want to see if that sedentary behavior is placing a burden on the heart, right? So we're trying to remove all potential confounding factors. Just coming back to the measurement part, because that is an important part of this internally valid model. One thing we often do, a measurement gets validated for use in a certain condition, in a certain posture, etc. And then people use it in different ways, and it's not been validated for use in that way. So here, as an example, I am interested in the effects of sedentary behavior, meaning people are sitting. But the measurement has been validated for use in the supine posture, where people are laying down. So how do I overcome that? Lots of people have been using the measurement in the seated posture, but that's not valid. You can't do that, right? And I don't have a great answer for that. I'm just saying that's a consideration and something we have to use when interpreting our results. That doesn't mean we take our eye off these other factors, right? External fluidity, which is our ability to generalize our findings to other populations, does remain important. So, for example, I'm looking at sedentary behavior in the general population. Here, I was more interested in those with diabetes. My biologically plausible model would change. Because if I'm dealing with people with type 2 diabetes, my number one concern is glycemic control. It is not regulating hemodynamics, which is blood flow and pressure and stuff around the body, right? And so I think different strategies would be needed if I want to regulate glycemic control. And then we should also think about ecological fluidity. So ecological fluidity is a subtype of external fluidity, and it basically means but would people actually do it? right? So if I'm getting someone to do this really elaborate intervention, but no one is ever going to do it, is it really worth studying, right? Then we get to the pre-intervention. Oh, sorry, then we get to the intervention mapping phase after we started to establish this biological plausibility. And I'm thanking Anna here. So I was basing most of my stuff on this intervention mapping, and she very kindly sent me this behavior change wheel model, which did result in some stress because I was on my way to Missouri a month ago to give a talk. And I'm like, oh crap, I've got new information. I need to change my slides. So I was working on the plane when I was reading the book that she sent. This is a really cool read, and I think I'm leaning more towards this, but I'm somewhere in between these models. Now, here's what the intervention mapping looks like. So these are all the things you think about before doing that randomized controlled trial, that RCT. What is the need, right? You have to define the health problem. What are your outcomes and objectives? Like what am I trying to measure? What the intervention design, what goes into the intervention? How do you produce the intervention? What tools do you use to help the intervention work? How do you implement the intervention, and then how do you evaluate it? So these are like iterative steps that you work through and could take many studies before you're ready to actually do that RCT. And then we come to the behavior change wheel, which is a variation. And in this one, you have policy around the edge. And again, I'm interested in this part, guidelines. You have in the middle, the sources of one's behavior that's broken down into capability, opportunity, and motivation. And then around here, these are functions that we could use to change the behavior. So we look at this in more simple format, and I will come back and show you this in terms of how we're using it. But first, you want to understand the behavior. If we don't really understand the behavior, we can't fix it, right? And again, I'll come back to this. We're talking about sedentary behavior. Seems like something that's simple, right? It's really not. It's a complex behavior. Then, when we understand the behavior, then we can start to identify options for the intervention, right? Like things we're going to work on, and then tools that we can use in order to make that intervention work. So, starting with understanding the behavior, first we have to define the problem. So, with sedentary behavior, and here's one of the things that we're doing right now. You're sedentary in many different places, right? So right now you're sitting, listening to a lecture. Of course, you've got low stress and you're all enthralled because I'm amazing, right? But sometimes you're sitting there getting stressed and so on as well. Other times you're studying or you're watching TV. Other behaviors are happening at the same time. It gets, you start to peel the onion, right? It gets complex. So we have to like understand the behaviors, and then we can't fix all of that. So what part of that do we want to change? And then, who they're doing it with, what they're actually doing, when, where, how often, etc. Right? But they're things that we need to consider, and then we can look at, well, what do we need to change? What's motivating these behaviors? Again, we can't just say stop being sedentary, eating, smoking. Just doesn't work, right? But we do want to come up with something simple like the FIT guidelines that we have for exercise right now, right? If we could tell people how often they interrupt the behavior and what they do while they're interrupting it, that would be much more amenable. And then I said we have this behavioral interdependence. This is why we have to understand the behavior, because the sedentary behavior is going to interact with those other 24-hour activity behaviors. But again, also, if you're there watching a movie at night, you're not eating broccoli, right? You're eating ice cream or something else. And if that's where we need to intervene, we need to understand what else you're doing. As well, there are complexities there, because again, you don't just sit, right? You eat, you get stressed, etc., etc. Sitting in complicated behavior. So then when we understand the behavior, then we can start to figure out, well, what needs to change, right? What is leading to those behaviors in the first place? Because the behavior doesn't just magically occur, but something's motivating that behavior. And then I have been using this socio-ecological model, but thanks to Anna confusing me, I'm also using COM-B now, and I've kind of combined those. So in here, this is the COM-B part of it. We've got motivation for the behavior, but that motivation interacts with your capability in terms of changing the behavior and your opportunity to change it. And these are individual level factors, so as in you, but we know that we can't just consider the individual when attempting to change behavior. There has to be a social and physical environment that supports change in that behavior, and that's where we're at there. Okay, so we understand the behavior, and now we want to identify options and content or strategies for change, right? So I said we had capability, motivation, and opportunity. Here's some examples here. If capability, we want to raise someone's capability to interrupt their sedentary behavior, maybe we get them to set goals. And then a technique we could use is for them to self-monitor, right? We give a watch or something like that. Motivation might be raising their self-belief about their capacity to do it. We could use strategies such as mental rehearsal. The opportunity I've broken down into two levels because I like the socio-ecological part, but at a social level, maybe we want to create an environment that enables change in that behavior, right? So we want to facilitate social support. At a physical environment level, and I think this is the part I think is really cool. Like we're talking about exercise and creating opportunities to exercise. We have to remap neighborhoods, put gyms on, green space, etc. With sedentary behavior, we could do simple things around the house and the office, right? Sit the sand desk, put the bin further away from the desk, change the social environment and put markings around an office and making it social norm to get up and walk around every so often, if we know that's where we need to intervene. And then, okay, so now we've got our intervention or a semblance thereof. We're still not ready. We have to know whether it's feasible. And people conflate feasibility with pilot study, but feasibility is a big term. And here's a framework used by the NIH, which is called the Bowen's framework. So we've got this intervention, but is that intervention going to be acceptable? Is there demand for it? How do we implement it? Is it practical? Do we need to adapt it in any way? How is it going to integrate in the medical system or whatever system you're trying to put it in? Is there opportunities for expansion? And then, you know, when we're testing feasibility, we want to start to establish that biological plausibility, but that wouldn't be our primary focus. It's basically the question here is, can we do it? And is it worth doing, right? We might design an intervention that's not actually going to be worth doing and we'd be wasting time and money. So, okay, now we've got our first intervention. Now we then start to test whether it's efficacious, right? So I've come up with the best sedentary behavior interruption strategy. Now I test its efficacy. Efficacy means, does it work? Do I change arterial stiffness by interrupting this behavior? And for efficacy, this is under controlled conditions. And then we have effectiveness. Does it work in the real world? So just coming back to here, again, we're still very focused on this cause and effect, like increasing biological plausibility. We have high internal fluidity here. We're controlling the environment because we want to know this biological plausibility. And this is your typical randomized control trial. But don't forget, we also need effectiveness. And this is something I took straight from NIH website. And you see on here, these steps are very similar to what I was saying before. And it's just coincidence, I saw this after. But, you know, we start off with the mechanistic research, then we go to efficacy, then effectiveness before looking at implementation. So effectiveness is it working in the real world under conditions that aren't controlled, right? And throughout all of this, we should also be looking at fidelity, like how successfully can we implement it, like how often are people doing it and monitoring it, and then you can look at reasons as to why people may not be exercising on every day they should. We need to evaluate it, and we should be considering scalability throughout, but I'm going to come back to that term because that's our last part. Now is like, does it work? That's our last question. So now we need to think about implementation and scalability. And excuse my French, but this is the part that scares the shit out of me, because this is the really difficult part, right? So now we've got this intervention, we've shown it's efficacious, we've shown it, we get all the doctors to prescribe it, we can make a difference. But how do we actually get the whole population to do it, right? So if I'm putting these guidelines in the practice, who delivers the guidelines? Is it the physician, the PA, the nurse? Is it by a form? What needs to be on that form? What content do we need to deliver? Where? Does the physician or whoever it is do it in person or remote? When do they do it each visit? How do you integrate that into a system? Now, trying to put anything into the electronic medical records is super, super difficult, right? Even like putting a simple question about sedentary behavior in there. And I've been doing this with physical activity just at UNC, and it's a pain, right? It's really, really hard. It takes years building up trust and so on. This stuff, like how do we actually get it out there is really, really difficult. It's exciting. There's some cool stuff we need to do here, but we don't have the answers to it. And then, we can't forget about scalability. Right? Scalability means, okay, is it going to work in every doctor's office? I'm just using doctor's office as an example, across the country, in different settings, in different communities, and so on. Is it really going to be of benefit to everyone? And then hopefully we have our solution, right? Now, mine definition is I want public health guidelines that are feasible and effective for all. I don't know exactly what the solutions are going to look like at the end, but I want something like this, the 24-hour activity cycle. I don't know how I'm going to make this simple though, because if I break this down, if I look at exercise, and again, that's moderate to vigorous physical activity, that part is not too bad because we're talking about duration, right? People should be getting 30 minutes, and we've got fit principle for that. Light physical activity, is it just duration? Is it how many times they do it? We don't know. Sedentary behavior, I don't think it is duration. It's how often sedentary behavior is interrupted. I think that's going to be more important. How are they interrupting sedentary behavior? Are they standing? Are they walking around? Are they doing simple resistance exercises? That part gets really murky. And then sleep, I don't even know. Right? I mean, we know duration is important, but we can't forget about quality. Different people have different circadian rhythms. Well, some of you are morning people, some of you are evening people. How do we align all of that and get it in one page, right? But like, we're really going to make a difference. That's where we need to get to, and I have no idea right now. But I'm excited to continue on the journey. So again, we go through all of these stages, then hopefully we get to the solution. Again, I have an idea of the solution, but not exactly what it's going to look like right now. But I'm excited to keep working towards that. And before I make any dent whatsoever, I think I've got at least 20 years plus, right? Oh, another picture. This is me and some of my lab team. There's my wife and dog, Harry. This is a very famous dog. That's Mark. You should look up his dog Biffo on Instagram. The dog makes lots of money. He's always got cute outfits and stuff. All right, so just to finish off then, what are we doing? Like how are we contributing to this framework we put together? At the moment, we're down here, right? We're just starting. Our first study is called SWITCH, which is sitting with interruptions for total cardiovascular health. I'm saying total cardiovascular health because I wanted to work the brain in there. People forget the brain is part of the cardiovascular system. Stroke is a cardiovascular disease. And I wanted to fit in there and keep it neat because I do want to look in dementia and that the line. There's a big link between sedentary behavior and dementia. In this study, what we're basically doing is we are trying to identify the mechanisms by which sedentary behavior is burdening the heart, and based on those mechanisms, identifying strategies for interrupting that behavior, and then identifying potential factors that may help to motivate that strategy, right, for us to implement it in the real world. Our model looks something like this. Like if we understand these determinants of interrupting that behavior, and we know what to tell people to do in terms of interrupting, we can improve these mechanisms, decrease arterial stiffness, and therefore decrease stroke and cardiovascular disease. Then our next one is called context. In this one, we're trying to understand more about the context in which people are being sedentary. I'm particularly interested in young adults, what they're doing while they are being sedentary, so we can tease out how much of it is due to the sedentary behavior versus co-occurring behaviors, and then like build models around that, because I think personally we could use sedentary behavior as a crux, right? I mean, that in and of itself may not make as big a dent as we want, but if we're using sedentary behavior and focusing on that, but also improving nutrition and sleep and other stuff, right? It's our inroads, but hopefully in a simple way. And then we're looking at the determinants of those behaviors, and then it's all wrapped in an intervention mapping protocol. It looks something like this. This is our socio-ecological model, things that we're trying to understand in terms of these behavioral factors, like individual, inter-individual, and physical environment level. So if we can understand those behaviors that are leading to the sedentary behavior, and then we can start to figure out, okay, where do we go in? Where do we intervene? What strategies do we need to use? On this, one of the cool things we're doing is we put accelerometers on them. You have to look at sedentary behavior, you have to put one on the thigh, the wrist and waist ones don't work very well. And then we're using these bedside monitors to track sleep, and then ecological momentary analysis, which is a fancy way of saying an app is going to bother you 9 times a day. So your phone will bleep, and then you get asked these questions about what you're doing and who, with, and where. So these fit in with our socio-ecological model, so we can see where people are being sedentary. And as I said, it's all wrapped in this intervention mapping protocol. And again, I might change this a bit. Now, thanks again, Anna, for confusing me. I'm picking on her a lot, haven't I? Everyone should just look at her right now. Make you sit uncomfortable. It's the first time we met today as well, and I'm already picking on her in person. But I'm not going to go through all those parts. They're the parts that I told you before. And then another one of our next areas is that part, like taking a step back in time, right, and understanding more about what we can learn from our ancestors in terms of this behavior and its importance to health. And I mentioned Herman. If you haven't read it, you should read his book, Burn. It's about, he's an evolutionary biologist. And this book is about the evolution of metabolism. And he has this theory called constrained energy theory that he has published everywhere. In Science, in national proceedings, all the top journals. And he has tested metabolism on every species imaginable. The first person to do it in apes. And now we've done it in rats and bottlenose dolphins and you name it. And it's come up with this theory, constrained energy. And I think this might fit in with our sedentary behavior model. He believes that when you increase physical activity by a high amount, your total daily energy expenditure does not increase by the amount that you would calculate based on the mechanical need for that action, right? I.e., say you need 2,000 kilocalories a day, right? That's what you need for your basal metabolic rate and your usual activities. You now engage in a lot of exercise and exposed to that exercise. We know that it costs 500 kilocalories a day. Therefore, your total daily energy expenditure should be 2,500. The math doesn't work. So when you calculate, people's total daily energy expenditure changes very minimally, if at all, and if it does change, it comes back down. Herman's theory is that you are redirecting energy away from non-essential processes, including inflammation and oxidative stress and the bad stuff, right? But you maintain your essential processes. So we want to test that, and this one we sent off in June. We just got for the first time, we just got a borderline score back. This is another RO1. So should be good next time. I'm glad we didn't get this time because I couldn't do it right now, which is crazy. But this should be starting next year as well. We're gonna experimentally test his theory and understand more about the evolution of metabolism. But overall, from those, hopefully we're going to understand more about what's the optimal dose for interrupting sedentary behavior, understand more about this biological plausibility. Like, we are looking primarily at that hemodynamic factors, but we're measuring everything as well, including metabolism, understand more about behavioral determinants, and then we can start to design RCTs, like to get at whether this is efficacious. We are doing additional work as well. We got one of my PhD students got a T32 looking at sedentary behavior and endometrial cancer. We have another RO1 running in the lab looking at arterial aging in pregnant women and their offspring. And of course, we built sedentary behavior and 24-hour activity cycles into that. I had to figure out how to measure vascular health on one-day-old babies, which is really cool, but I thought I was going to break them because they don't want to move. We have a couple of other RO1s under review looking at myocardial infarction and 24-hour activity cycle during pregnancy. And then some additional ones in prep looking at cancer and cerebrovascular system. And one of my PhD students is looking at it in the LGBTQIA plus community. Again, all contributing towards this, but we're still way down there. So that's me and my talk, and I probably went longer than I thought, but let me come up here. But thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lee. Great talk. We actually have the room for another 30 minutes. So if anybody wants to ask some questions, please do. Lee will be around this afternoon in the lab and then pretty much around all day. But does anybody have any questions now for Lee?
Yeah.
So do you think the current guidelines around like just trying to get more steps per day are like 4 recommendations, or do you think that's sort of a good baseline to start with, since so many people have some sort of accelerometer attached to it?
There is actually, more work going into that step part because the physical activity guidelines aren't working. But that's physical activity, right? It's not sedentary behavior. But there are people who think that's where we should be heading, just making it even simpler. Because right now, we all think fit is good prescription, right? But we're the choir. We need to make even simpler strategies available for the general public. So like something has to change, right? Because we get worse every year. But yeah, good question. And we don't know the best way to present those steps as well. There are different metrics and so on that we can use. The difference between different devices. There's still a lot that needs to be done there, but it is an area of interest. Yes.
Well, thank you for this talk. Great.
I'm picking on you.
Kind of like a silly question, but I have, talking about sedentary behaviors and haven't been in that class for a long time. I've seen a couple of us fidgeting.
Yeah,
Is there anything that you can tell us about fidgeting?
it's a good question. So, the first person who have done an acute sedentary behaviour study, which was only a few years ago, was Jumei Padilla at Missouri, and that was an interruption strategy that he looked at, and he did show that the fidgeting did help to preserve vascular function in the legs. One of the first ones I did show it didn't help with the heart. So now I do think mechanistically there's some potential there, and it may be population specific because our belief is what one of the major mechanisms by which sedentary behaviour is leading to disease is that blood pooling, right? And there are 3 ways of getting blood back to the heart. One is the respiratory pump. When you breathe in and out, it's like a sump, right? The veins can constrict a little, not very much. But the major one is the muscle pump. So, when the calf muscles squeeze, it pushes blood back up to the heart, and fidgeting could help with that. But maybe not for all populations. We don't know, at least for the young and healthy, it wasn't enough. Good one.
Yeah, so just a general, I guess, question I would have is what can we do for us? And I know you said, sit less, move more. What would be one takeaway that we could share with others, maybe those that don't move as much as maybe we do, or people in this room that we can share with them and encourage them to move more?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the simplest way right now is not to think about physical activity and sedentary behaviour as part of the same continuum, because they're not. Because most people are being sedentary because they think they've earned it, right? So if you want to try and get them to be active, but then also make sure just don't sit for too long at a time, and that's as good as we know right now. But if they think about that separate, I think for me, I think that's as good as we have right now. But that's one simple strategy, so, which is just conceptual, right? But it's something simple we could give people. Yeah, but those kind of questions are the good ones, because that's how we need to think. We need to, as scientists, we often think in levels of complexity, right? But it's our job to do all the complex stuff so we can make it simple. And again, there may be better strategies, but it's not simple. If no one does it, it's not a good strategy, right? So, yeah.
I got a kind of different type question for you. A lot of like young scientists and then aspiring researchers in here, and obviously you've carved a pretty unique niche for yourself with the sedentary behavior sphere and realm, right? And there's not a whole lot of other people in it. So I was just curious if you wouldn't mind just talking just real briefly about how did you get into studying sedentary behavior in the first place? Because now you can extrapolate to all these different populations. So
I'd like to say I planned it all, but the easiest answer is I'm just a survivalist, and I have a high level of resiliency, not because of any inner strength, just because I've got a memory like a goldfish, right? And I forget. But I moved here from New Zealand, and I was looking at lifestyle in kids, not specifically sedentary behavior, but then get into the US and the tenure club stuff. And knowing here in New Zealand, I wanted to go bring a kid to the lab. I'm not kidding. I would rock up in my car that is unmarked, go into the school and say, "Can I pick up Johnny?" And they call Johnny, and I just go off. They don't check anything. But there's no way here, right? And it takes years to develop those relationships. Like, it's a very difficult population to work with. And I knew that wasn't going to be an optimal strategy for me working towards tenure. And so then, not that I've given up, but I also know that there's just nobody looking at the young adult population. And they're an easy population to access, at least at college level. 70% of high school graduates in the US go to college, and they're in an environment that it's like a micro environment, right? That we can change it. We can't change the whole country, but a college campus, there's a huge capacity for making change at multiple levels, like simple things we could do to have really meaningful change for people's health. that then could hopefully be scalable, it could be emulated elsewhere. I'm still making it sound more planned than it was. I didn't have that direction coming on. I just went with things that I'm interested in, and I was involved in everything. It's just this area that hit. And again, I had the general area, right? I was a cardiovascular person. I like measurements. I did lifestyle behavior and cardiometabolic stuff. But now I'm super focused, and that's what I do personally. But you know, I'm involved in lots of other stuff because I have techniques that people want. And that is what I would recommend more what I say rather than what I did. One, seek mentors. Like there are lots of people around who want to mentor, and that doesn't mean one. I'm saying mentors, plural. Right? Do not limit yourself to one. Not one mentor can give you everything that you need. I've got my female students. I make sure there's also. I like to have more than one mentor, kind of officially at UNC. We can only have one official, but you know we say we co-mentor. But I like to make sure they have a female mentor. I've got a gay student. I made sure he's got someone that also understands that community, because as much as I try, I can't fully put myself into those shoes. And then there'll be other areas just outside of your identity and so on, right? Not one person can give you everything. And you know, I try and identify people who've been successful. And you know, that requires a little help from people like you to show what success is, right? And just ask them questions, ask them to go for a coffee. But most people, it's very easy to look at these people who've done a lot and think they're big, scary people. They've got no time for me. You'd be surprised, like especially if they're on the conference circuit and they're going to do talks and stuff. Most want to talk to people. So do that, listen to them, and then like get them to try and help you define an area that you're interested in and be focused. I think until I had, I'm not kidding, like 2 R01s, and I was part of a whole bunch of others, and it was like $15 million of funding at one time. I had imposter syndrome, right? And everyone in this room has it or has had it, right? You're all thinking, oh, that person knows more than me. And it's hard to get over that if you're a jack of all trades as well. And so the one lesson is that everyone has imposter syndrome. Don't think that you're less than the next person. That next person is thinking that as well. Be vulnerable. As long as you put an effort in, mistakes are good, right? If we don't learn from what we do right, we need to make mistakes. We need to explore. We need to put ourselves out there. And yeah, it's a journey, right? It's not a race. I think I went off on all kinds of tangents.
No, it's great advice.
Yeah.
So I have a comment and a question. My comment really goes to what you just said, and to the students, to not have such a narrow focus that you can't be open to other ideas because you'll miss opportunities. And I'm a perfect example of that. And it's just if you're so rigid that you can't really see that whole the forest for the trees, you're going to miss out on opportunities to partner with people, to be mentored by folks. And I think what you said is very true. The imposter syndrome I mean, I've seen it. Individuals exactly like yourself. I don't know if people ever really get over it.
And especially women and minorities as well. Like everyone here has a voice, and they should use it and feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah. And if you don't know what that is, you should read about it. There's lots of studies about it, commentaries.
I can tell you all about it if you want to.
Yeah, right. There's a lot of research to touch that. So, and if you're feeling that way, you need to have a conversation, because I think you can get support in sort of how to work through that. My question is, as a scientist, we're supposed to stay laser focused on where we are in that process, and you outlined that very well. I'm just wondering, sort of in your current work, have you thought, a few steps ahead about when the policies created, or the at the provider role? I'm a nurse practitioner, so the provider piece is really interesting to me. but looking at where, what we really consider as providers and where that intervention might take place as far as certainly primary care makes a whole lot of sense. But looking at our physical therapy providers, our sort of what might not jump out as obviously as an obvious place to intervene. Have you thought much through that?
Right, that's the implementation
Right.
side of things, and part said scared the shit out of me.
Right.
But I think, you know, your comments in the forest for the trees is one I use a lot as well, and it's a great analysis, right? Because I don't understand all those things, and there's no way I could, right? I'm good at one area, and I don't even think I'm particularly strong physiologist. I'm good at, but I'm pretty good at it, and I know a lot about, not a lot, but a bit about other stuff, enough that I can be part of a team and work with folks, and I do work with implementation scientists, and they're the ones who've been taking me over to the dark side and helping me in doing all of this stuff, because if we're not thinking about that, we're not going to make any difference. And a nurse practitioner is a really good example, I think. You have way more impact than a physician does.
In some instances.
But in terms of like your interactions with people and your capacity for change, and we know that in general, nurse practitioners have a lot more empathy, or at least they're more likely to be part of training and so on as well, right? That's not my personal area, but it is always a consideration, because the whole way I have to be thinking about those last steps, what that solution would look like.
Well, I think you had a really good point. And for those of you who look at implementation of a variety of things, the getting a check sheet, even a check box in electronic health records is, I can't even tell you what a major hurdle that is. It seems like such an obvious thing. It's like, well, we should add this so that we're doing our health screening. It generates this data for us. To get that through a large system and onto a health record is a major.
And I've been doing it with Exercise is Medicine, and at UNC, or Exercise is Medicine, if you don't know, is a big ACSM initiative. It's global, and the whole point of it is to make physical activity a vital sign, right? So something that's measured every time you go to the doctor's office, along with blood pressure and weight and so on. And all it requires is two simple questions. How many times a week do you exercise? And for how long? Right? And you know, the first one is I don't. The next question you don't need to get answered, right? So it sounds simple. And I thought, oh, I could do that. When I went to UNC, I started it as soon as I got there. And it took 2 years just to build relationships with doctors, right? And I have a lot of perseverance as well. I've become very American as well. You see, I'm smiling. We're all miserable in England. I'm just happy, and I have a lot of perseverance, and I'm loud and speak up a lot. And it took a lot of that, and a lot of me sending graduate students over there do internships and stuff, because it's not just getting in there. First, it's persuading them they need to, right? And I had a group there that wanted to, right? And at first, I tried to work with geriatrics. I had to go give talks. I'm not kidding. The doctors did not know that exercise was good. Like they did not know you could do that instead of taking metformin or doing something else, right? I had to tell them really basic, and they wouldn't believe it. Which means,
why do you think, as from a student's perspective, why do you think adding that extra little box? I mean, it seems like such a fantastic idea. Why do you think that would be a barrier? Well, if you ask somebody about exercise and they answer, what does that then do? Creates a conversation, right? Well, hopefully, I mean, that would be the ideal, right? Start that. I mean, to me, that seems like a great idea.
but
But
that's
then
the
there's more
issue.
time.
And it's not just the time, though. The exercise is not part of the formal training for medical school. South Carolina did it first. I don't know anyone else that has yet. So if they do that and someone asks questions, the doctor doesn't know what to say, and that's a big barrier. So then what kind of training do we need to give them in order for them to be comfortable to do that? And then, okay, what resources do they also need to have? Like what handouts? Or then they need to be referred to an exercise professional. How do you refer them? And then if they're referred, how do I get the information back to my systems, like all the HIPAA protection? And it goes on and on.
It's the whole goes back to whenever I ask a question, you're not sure what the answer's gonna be and how you're gonna deal with it.
Who pays for it?
Who pays for it?
Exactly. They're just like and again, at UNC, I've got people, the team there really want to do it, and it took years to get going. And it still takes a lot of maintenance. Now I have multiple graduate students and postdocs helping me with it, like, because they want to do it. But grad students have to go and do an internship and I tell them to do it. They want it. But it is meaningful stuff, so they like it.
Thank you.
Have there been any changes made on UNC's campus regarding this research that you've been doing in attempts to try and implement any things?
No, not at a scale yet. I mean, I do direct exercise medicine, and we want to start with, because again, we're just getting into a place where we're getting referrals electronically, we're getting information back. It took a long time, and and that's me doing something that I get 0 credit for. Like, me doing EIM, no one cares. For my promotion, at UNC, all that matters is research, right? So that EIM stuff is just it's just bothering to everyone else. So I'm doing it because I like doing it, and I think it has value, but I don't have lots of resources for me to do it, right? So it's taken a while to get there, but I do think that something like exercise is medicine, because it has a recognized branding, ACSM can be used as an umbrella. And part of the thing with EIM is, I mean, we want to get this in as a vital sign, but it's also a way to connect the campus. And I don't know how it is here, but at UNC, there's lots of good resources, but they have committees to talk about developing committees, right? And you go to a committee to talk about going to the next one. So none of them, it's not consolidated. And there are lots of people who want to do difference, but there's just not enough leadership and enough centralization, and people just say, look, we need to do this. I think EIM is a way of doing it. And by resources, I mean like outdoor education, campus rec, CAPS, and other resources at student health. But they just think inside the box, because mental health is a big issue, especially in academia. But that's a way to integrate all of that. That's what I want to do.
So you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that even if someone exercises a lot, but is also sedentary a lot, that doesn't really matter. You're still at the same risk. So would you, and you were also saying that being sedentary and changing that behavior frequently is probably the most important thing. So frequency is really what matters, is doing, not sitting more and moving.
I don't know for sure, but based on the limited evidence that there is, and mechanistically, I believe it's the change in posture, and it's not going to be black and white. Now, and I say that as one example is use of sit to stand desks, right? However, that doesn't mean you use a sit to stand desk all day. Everyone's got one now, and there's not much evidence to support use of sit to stand desks. There is evidence to show that it causes back problems. So it may be useful, but not all day. And standing is not. And the idea is changing posture and replacing it with light physical activity. I don't think standing is a light physical activity. And then how do you define standing, right? Is this standing? Is this standing? Is a chef at a station? Is that standing? It's not the same. And standing like this is less than 1.5 minutes when we actually measure it. So it doesn't actually fall within any category, and your blood still pools here. I mean, you guys seen the videos online, right? The beef eaters in the UK where they've been standing all day and they just pass out. Because all the blood is pulled down in the legs, right? Because they're not activating the muscle pump. Same thing as if they're sitting, so they're still getting the same problem. So that what we cannot do and what we do far too often, not just in science, as a society, is make things binary and say, oh, we're just going to do that instead. Never that simple, right? But we don't have the answer right now, but we do need to do all the complicated stuff to make it more simple. It's a good question. Yeah, these are the cool questions about the philosophical stuff, right? Because none of you can go and fact check me as well and say I'm wrong. Yeah.
How do you combat sedentary behavior in those who are disabled to the point where they have no choice but to be sedentary?
Yeah.
I'm not saying like they're
Yeah.
muscle already dead, but like they can move, but they just can't move enough.
Yeah. Another great question, and one that we have thought about a little, but not enough. And that, yeah, first is how do you define sedentary in that population, right? If they're confined to a wheelchair, say, I mean, that's just their behavior. That's not a behavioral choice. There, I think we're going to have to be more imaginative, really, and like mechanistically, like if they can only use the upper body, that's not going to offset the changes that are happening. That actually may put more burden on the heart. Maybe, we don't know. We need to get blood down to the lower extremities. My PhD was in spinal cord, working with spinal cord injured patients. These guys, and I'm saying guys because nearly all spinal cord injuries are men because we're stupid, right? So, it's either like if they're white, it's an automobile accident. If it's black, it's a gunshot wound. That's not my opinion. That's just like factual. Whoever we are as men, we put ourselves in situations. But yeah, their legs are like literally that big, all the way down. If you look at a blood vessel, there's no blood. I guess just like dormant, right? And if there's no blood in it, it means that that blood vessel is not getting stimulus. The way that the health of our blood vessels is mostly regulated is by shear stresses, like a hemodynamic stress. When blood flows through it, it creates this shearing stress on the arterial wall. If blood is flowing as it should in a laminar fashion, I don't want to get too into physics, but it deforms the shape of the wall bit, and then the vessel says, "Oh, we're under stress. We need to release stuff to alleviate that stress, including nitric oxide, right, which dilates the vessels, and that nitric oxide is also one of the major molecules preventing atherosclerosis and heart disease stuff, right? So, like mechanistically, we need that to occur in the legs. So it might be, and I have been involved in a bit of this, but strategies such as using pneumatic compression, or it could be passive leg movement stuff. IPC is good because it can just be automated throughout the day, right? And not that expensive, like $4,000. I mean, they're still expensive, but compared to what they're paying for wheelchairs and other stuff, it's a chance to save their lives. Because I mean, these men are like 18 or 30 when it happens. They become insulin resistant within a year, diabetic, and die early of cardiovascular disease. Right? So it's an awesome question, and there isn't much research at all.
Seems
Right
like
now.
an area.
Oh, it's definitely an area that needs work because it's a challenging one.
It's like I ask because I dealt with a lot of people who like just can't move, or like they've been getting older, and it's because a lot more pain, or they've been in the military and they got hurt a lot, and range of motion is becoming so less, much less for them. So like it's getting harder and harder to move.
Yeah, some of that's a bit more difficult as well because some of that range of motion is because they haven't been doing any range of motion, right? So again, it's where it's not so simple. It's like looking at the person as a whole rather than just looking at that one thing, because that person might be very different to the spinal cord injured person. So there are guides like these things. We can have guidelines and suggestions for things, right? They're not. We shouldn't take them all verbatim. But yeah, it's a good area to get into, but also a difficult population to recruit, right? So you have to think about that. You can do a PhD in that. I'm not saying don't do it, but think about definitely don't do an intervention because you never graduate. Like do observational studies.
think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Earlier in the presentation, answering your question, you used the term
Atherosclerosis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Explain that.
Yeah, so, I mean, there are two conditions that occur in the vessel that are damaging: atherosclerosis and arteriosclerosis. Athero comes from the Greek words like sludge or like gruel and hardening, right? Atherosclerosis is when you've got too many of those low density lipoproteins floating around. The function of the vessel is not working very well, including not releasing enough nitric oxide, and the vessel wall is semi-permeable normally, and that nitric oxide stops that LDL crossing the barrier and sticking on the wall. And if that LDL, if the nitric oxide is not there though, it can cross the wall and it gets stuck in there. Right, so now you send out macrophages to try and clear it up, but where do those macrophages go? Right, so then like plaque starts to build, then it calcifies, and that's where you see the big white bumps in people's vessels, and then eventually that calcification can rupture, right, and then that rupture, so the plaque, the calcium that comes out will move around the body and get lodged in the heart and cause a heart attack, or in the brain and cause a stroke. And it normally happens, the most prevalent places are around big bifurcations, like bends in vessels. So we get a lot down there. So disease might be happening here, but that's what's going to lead to your heart attack or stroke. And we get in the carotid as well. A lot of the stroke happens because the atherosclerosis here in the carotid artery. And the other process is arteriosclerosis, which is a hardening of the vessel, and that means that the structural proteins around the vessel build up too much, and the vessel becomes really hard. Now, if the vessel is hard, it can't pulse much. Blood pressure is going to go up a lot, and the heart gets put under a lot of burden, and pressure waves shoot forward and start to damage other end organs, including like the kidneys and the brain and stuff. That help?
Yeah, that helped a lot.
Right.
Last question. Any more questions? All right. Thanks so much, Lee. We appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Appreciate it.
Within 4 years.